Hi guys, what's up YouTube family? Ian and Jess checking back in. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope you guys are falling in love. Hope you guys are one step closer to your dreams and goals. So guys, we're going to be doing an awesome video today. Hopefully you guys really enjoy it. Hopefully you guys take all of this information in. It is a very important video. It's probably the most important video we ever make. And we have done a piece of this topic already in a previous video. And as we've told you guys before, the Pakistani government had requested a ban on this video. So we believe the algorithm has been messing around with it. But nonetheless, guys, let's get into it. So the topic of today, guys, is about how chapter 18 of the Quran was basically copied from a Syriac Christian story. So as we know, there's many scholars, non-Islamic scholars and Islamic scholars, that have done very meticulous work around breaking down the Quran and trying to see its origins. You see, what starts to happen, guys, is there's this big misinterpretation, right? And misrepresentation that the Hafs version of the Quran, which is the most popular version today, actually comes from a 1923 adoption from the Egyptians, right? So as we know, the Egyptians basically was testing high school students out on the Quran, and because there were like more than 30 versions at the time, it caused a lot of confusions and people were getting things wrong. So they decided to throw everything in the Egyptian in the Nile River, and basically they adopted the Hafs Quran, and from there it worked out. And the Hafs Quran's popularity came from the Ottomans, and basically what had happened was, in the 1980s, when the new royal family finally took over Saudi Arabia, they decided to adopt the Hafs Quran as the primary one because of its popularity and how it worked in Egypt, right? Because there's many different versions of the Quran, and that's how kind of like it became this globalized product per se, where every Muslim majority, 98% of them, are using it, right? Now, the point of the story is, guys, when we think about the Quran, right, the issue is that there are many different areas in the Quran which are gray and dark, meaning that we don't know why it's there or what's its true meaning, and we start to see this parallel between the biblical stories, whether it be the New Testament or whether it be the Old Testament, where there's this biblical facsimiles, right? And what happens is that also, not to mention, forgot to mention actually, the Zoroastrianism, which we did in another video. You see all these little parallels, right? So there's this whole paradigm in Islam of like copying and kind of like creating this new heresy per se, the Islamic heresy, right? Which is basically a Christian heresy, right? It's no different than a Nestorian or whatever type of other Arian heresy, whatever type of heresy you want to think about. But Islam is a Christian heresy. So the Quran is actually a Christian book. So guys, the Quran spends a lot of time defending itself and saying that it is an Arabic book. Why? Because many times Prophet Muhammad was blamed and accused of copying Christian stories and Persian folk tales, right? So therefore the Quran spends an awful lot of time, more than 10 times, guys, so many times, of defending that this is an Arabic book and that everything here is of Arabic origin, right? Now it's the same thing of why does the Quran spend so much time defending itself that it's an Arabic book, and it also states that if this book was not in Arabic, no one would believe it, right? Because why? If it wasn't in Arabic, then it couldn't claim this quote-unquote divine revelation from Allah, the boon God. Because if it was in another language, then people are going to say this is just an adoption of different religious ideologies, or Christianity or Judaism, etc., etc. But by saying it's an Arabic book, you're basically trying to say that this is something new under the divine Lord, and that the whole idea of Muhammad being Ummi, which is illiterate, is also a narrative that comes in there. But let's not stray too far from this. The most important thing today is that we're going to be talking about how, and we're going to show the historical proof that chapter 18 of the Quran was copied from a Syriac Christian story about Alexander the Great. So in chapter 18, there's this weird part that many people don't understand why it's there, but there's an actual background story to it. So what you guys need to understand is that chapter 18 of the Quran actually is a story about Alexander the Great. And the most mind-boggling thing, guys, is the actual fact that the historical document that we're going to use actually shows a complete sync, a complete parallel of words in the Quran and the Christian story. Now, a lot of people have this big issue of understanding of why this one fact destroys the fact that this is a book from God, right? So we need to focus on a timeline. So let's look at the timeline here, guys. Now, this timeline, we borrowed this picture of this timeline, but pay very close attention to this. Now, so guys, always remember that people in history have lied, but history never lies. So guys, Prophet Muhammad dies in the year 632, and in 652, Uthman compiles the two. Prophet Muhammad dies. And in 652, 20 years later, Uthman compiles, quote unquote, the perfect Quran, right? So now what had happened was Hafsa, which was Umar's daughter, which is the caliphate that was before Uthman, he had died. And what had happened was, this is one of Muhammad's wives, and what had happened was she had the quote unquote perfect copy of the Quran manuscripts. And she went to Uthman and she basically gave Uthman the manuscripts to compile the Quran. Now this is very important, guys. Understand something. When you see the Quran today, it is called modern Arabic. During the time of the compilation of the Quran, it was written in Old Arabic. So Old Arabic is missing all of the diacritical marks. You see these things here, all these dots and dashes, they're all gone. They never existed. This is how the original Arabic looked like. This is how the original Quran looked like. So the way people talk today in Arabic and the way people pronounce things and the way there's this ease of clarification of what a noun, pronoun, verb, and all these things were, it wasn't like that back then. So what had happened was, guys, after Uthman died, about 30 years later, guys, 30 to 50 years later, you have the diacritical mark invention. You get the invention of modern Arabic. Why is this important? This is important because if you pay attention to what we just said here, you will notice that without the diacritical marks, all these words, right, that have the different vowels in them that mean different words and they sound different, once the diacritical marks are gone, it all looks the same. So you're telling me more than 77,000 words and basically 6,236 verses, right? A scholar, a scribe had to sit there and put these new invention, these diacritical marks to make these words make sense. And you know how many mistakes he would make? So not only do you have an old Arabic Quran in the year 652 that is being made, now you have this translation of the Quran that's being made 30 to 50 years later, where scribes are trying to figure out what's the best fit for the words. That's the most important part. So the translation part, and the translation will be done by Persians, and we already know the Persians hated the Arabs. That's why there's many Persian words in there, and that's why the Quran is accused of having many non-Arabic words in it, right? So the point of the story is that's one thing you guys have to focus on. The second thing you guys have to focus on is, the second point is that Uthman burned all the Qurans in the year 652. So the issue is all the leaves, stones, parchment, bones that the Quran initially was written on, all of that stuff was destroyed. All the manuscripts were destroyed. The only thing that was left was Uthman's version. So the original sources of the material that Uthman used is all gone in history. So what was originally written down from Prophet Muhammad's lips by his scribes like Zayd ibn Thabit are all gone, right? So the original sources that we can compare to Uthman's Quran is gone. That's number one. Number two, he used Hafsa's manuscript, right? Now understand something, guys. Hafsa's manuscript was burnt 10 years after. So we no longer have Hafsa's manuscript to compare it to Uthman's manuscript, Uthmanic Quran. Therefore, we will never know if Uthman copied the original Quran. Why would Uthman burn all the evidence? He burnt it because his Quran was completely different than what the original Quran was. Now, this is very important. The book we have today, the Hafs version of the Quran, it is not the Uthmanic Quran. Why? What happened? What happened, guys, in Abd al-Malik in the year 690 plus, you will notice that when Abd al-Malik appears, they ask Abd al-Malik, what happened to the Uthmanic Quran? He said it disappeared. Abd al-Malik had said that he wanted to go collect the Quran and kind of like compile it. And why, if Uthman already did this? So 40 years after Uthman compiled the Quran, that quote-unquote goes into disappearance. And if you guys pay attention into history, guys, if you pay attention into history, there was never the word Quran. The Muslims invaded so many places and conquered so much territory during the time of Muhammad and 50 years after Muhammad. There was never a mention of the word Quran. So if the Quran was the holy book of the Muslims, why is there no historical accounts of the mention of the word Quran? Why is there no mention of Muslims? Why is this something that was mentioned in the 8th century? Why is the word Quran and Muslims mentioned in the 8th century under a new caliphate? So guys, the interesting thing here is that we start to notice that the historical timeline of the Quran between the year 632 and the year 710 starts to have a lot of issues here in the preservation and the governing powers that are happening. Another thing, guys, here, look, if you see, there's this guy, his name is Al-Hajjaj. He's a governor, and this guy is ruthless, right? He's ruthless. He literally even had his own little army in Syria, and one of the top prime quote-unquote Muslim generals wanted to dethrone him because of the amount of influence he had, right? They tried to assassinate this guy. This guy's a very important person here. So in the year 700, basically in the 8th century, he decided to kind of make Arab the dominant language. He kind of like wanted to destroy that Persian dialect and all these other little not Persian dialect, but Persian language, and destroy all these little type of languages around it. He wanted to make Arabic the dominant language, and he started to take things into his own hands. So what he did is he reformed the Quran. He wanted a uniform version where it had political strength, and he started to send these copies all over around. And what had happened, guys, these guys altered and change certain things that would kind of like fit with their political agendas. Why would the generals want to assassinate Al-Hajjaj? Why would the general of the army want to assassinate him if he wasn't such a terrible person? Why did he have such influence in the Syrian army in Syria? And why did he have this big kingdom over there as a governor? He's not even a caliphate. That's how much power and pull he had. But the point of the story is, between 632 and 710, there's a lot of tampering, there's a lot of confusion going on, and there's a lot of trick play going on with the preservation, compilation of the Quran. And as we know already from the hadiths and all the sources, the way the Quran was preserved was a joke, guys, right? So not only was the original Quran completely lost from history, we do not have the Uthmanic version, that's completely gone. The other part of the story is that, remember guys, according to the hadith here, is the Quran was preserved on stone, bones, parchment, leaves, wood, whatever thing was around, right? Muhammad had so much money, he was the perfect thief, he was the garbage, nasty person, right? And he had all this money, he stole so many things. He had Khadijah's empire, he stole caravans, he robbed, murdered, looted people. But the point of the story is, he never spent money on preserving the words of Allah, right? So the reality of it is, whatever piece of trash was laying around, they would write verses down. So the preservation tactic was garbage in the first place. Number two, the people of the Battle of Yamama. This is very important. These people at the Battle of the Yamama, they died. A vast majority of them, right? They died. These are the people that memorized the Quran. And the issue is that a vast majority of the Quran's been lost. So that is why Abu Bakr and Umar gave Zayd ibn Thabit the mission to go find the Quran. Because remember, the Muslims don't understand any type of logic. Umar, Abu Bakr, Uthman, Ali, Aisha, Hafsa, all these people, it doesn't matter. No one knew the Quran, because they would never have cared if the people in the Battle of Yamama would have died. They would have never told Zayd ibn Thabit to go find the Quran. And he wouldn't have been trying to say that going to find the Quran is like trying to move a mountain, like it was so hard. The reason he said these specific things, guys, is because it was an impossible task. Because the reality of it is, all of these people did not memorize the Quran. It was so hard. Think about it. Majority of these people were illiterate. They could not memorize all these words. They could not memorize 6,236 verses you're going to memorize by your head without reading a book. Everyone that memorizes the Quran today, they memorize it by having a teacher. They memorize it by a repetition by looking at a book that has words in it, and they're able to source it. Guys, you're talking about people who are illiterate, one, and then two, you're talking about people that are going to memorize 6,236 verses, 114 chapters of a book without seeing any written words. That sounds like the most impossible task ever. And you're saying multiple people remember that? So now understand something, guys. We had Ibn Masud and all these other folks that had different versions of the Quran at the time too, right? So Ibn Masud's Quran had 115 verses, the other guys had 112, 113, 111. So now the Quran that we have today has 114 verses. So there's this big discrepancy between how much surahs there are. And on top of that, if we pay attention to the hadiths, it says that one of the chapters that were lost was as long as Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the longest chapter in the Quran. So just imagine how much chapters are kind of lost from the Quran. Islamic scholars themselves says just say the truth, which is that we have what we have today is what is left of the Quran. Do not say that this is the whole Quran. You will be lying to say if this is the whole Quran. What we have today is what's left of the Quran. So once the people of battle, the people in the Battle of Yamama, half of those people basically are gone, dead. A vast majority of things are forgotten. Now understand this key important detail here, guys, right? This key important detail here. The Quran originally, the mantra, the story that we're told is that it's originally a oral transmission. So it is memorized through memory, right? So the Quran was learned and memorized through memory. It was never from a written piece of work. Now, why is this a problem? The reason that they created a written book, right, was because there was too many arguments. So the primary source of the Quran is the memorizers in Islam. The secondary source is actually the written book. Now the issue is, guys, the reason they needed a written book was because everyone had problems when they were praying or reciting verses in the Quran. Some would say this word wrong, or some would say that word wrong. So therefore what they did was they used the Quran as a secondary source to cross-reference things that they were saying. Okay, so that's very important for you to understand, right? Because these people all had problems. Now, the third point, guys. We have two manuscripts from this time period. We have the Birmingham manuscripts. Now, the Birmingham manuscripts come out about the time during of Prophet Muhammad, possibly due to carbon dating between, I don't know, I think it was 540 and 650, somewhere between that 100-year period. They have these manuscripts. Now, the Birmingham folios are basically just a few pages, guys, right? It's a fragment. It's not 114 chapters, 6,236 verses. It is not a Quran. It is just a few pages of the Quran. Now, the interesting thing about it is there's really nothing Islamic in there at all. One chapter that stands out the most is the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. Right, so the Birmingham manuscript, one piece of it talks about the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, which is a Christian story. So that's nothing Islamic at all. And number 2, we have the Sana manuscript, which comes about, right after Prophet Muhammad's death, within the ending of the 7th century. Now the issue here is that it's on a palimpsest, which basically is a piece of leather that basically it had eraser marks, and new words were written over previous works, right? So you can take a UV light and see all this type of stuff. So what the issue is that the Sana manuscript, half of it is like what we have today, and the other half of the Sana manuscript is completely contradicting, right? So you have this historical issue here. That's one problem. Now another thing, guys, to mention is that Uthman had claimed that he had burned all the manuscripts. But some way, somehow, we find manuscripts. So in Yemen, they found inside of a mosque that there were manuscripts, a whole bunch of them inside of this like wall. And when they broke the wall by accident, all these manuscripts came coming down. So people were afraid of Uthman as a rogue, because he was going around burning, quote unquote, the words of God, and they started hiding things, right? So now we realize that all of these different variables are going on at the time, right? What starts to happen is, the reason we tell you all of this information, because this chunk of information, I know it may seem like a lot to absorb, but this chunk of information is very important. Why? It's because if you pay attention to this information, there is no existence of a Quran with 6,236 verses, 114 surahs, matching what we have today in the Hafs version, between the time period of 632 and 750. Within the first 100 years, there is not one single complete Quran ever found. The second thing is, if you guys pay attention to the timeline, again, you will notice that from the time of Muhammad's death, 632, the biographies by Ibn Hisham, which he copied from Ibn Ishaq, comes 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. So now we have a 200-year gap in the biography of the man. The second point is the hadiths come 240 years after the death of the man. Now, why is this important? This is important because what we know about Prophet Muhammad, what we know about the life and teachings and sayings, come almost 300 years later under a new caliphate, under Persian territory, and most importantly, because it came so late and under a new caliphate, what happens is that now we cannot trust anything that is being said. Why? There's no contemporary evidence. So all the stuff that we know about Muhammad's life comes almost 300 years later. So when people try to argue and refute the evidence we're going to show and the things that we're going to talk about, they don't understand the timeline as we just explained it. So there's some sort of understanding in base, because you cannot talk about how the verses of the Quran that was revealed in Mecca and Medina. So these are the two areas where the verses were revealed, in Mecca and Medina. Now, they are going to tell you that this doesn't make any sense because in the first 10 years of the Hijrah, Muhammad was revealed these certain chapters, certain surahs. And they'll say in the last years of the Hijrah, Muhammad was revealed the remaining surahs of the Quran. So this doesn't make any sense. What they don't understand is that the story that tells us how Prophet Muhammad received these revelations come 200 years later. So the story of Jibreel coming to Muhammad is very vague and very tiny in the Quran. There is no explanation. There's no story. There's nothing in detail, guys. There's nothing in detail. We know nothing about it. It's very vague, right? We have to interpret it in a certain way. It's probably in a sentence or two, right? A verse or two. But the point of the story is a detailed explanation of how Prophet Muhammad received revelations and how his life was at the time of marrying Khadijah up to his point of getting these revelations from Jibreel in the cave comes from that documentary, that biography and hadiths, which is almost 300 years later. So when people argue about, Prophet Muhammad, that doesn't make any sense because he got revelations between this 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, the document you're using to source that, as we stated here, is coming from 200-300 years. You have no contemporary evidence to contest or refute what we're going to say because you don't have a document or a story from that time period. You have hearsays. So everything in Islam is all about, there's this chain of command of trusted people that memorize this or memorize that. Everything in Islam is all about memorization. For some reason, these people have some sort of God intelligence. They have some sort of God memory, right? This is the first time I remember. Well, we said before that this is a copycat of Zoroastrianism, where the Zoroastrians actually had this culture and heritage of kind of like memorizing their holy book by their quote-unquote religious teacher. And they would teach the next person to memorize it by heart. So it's kind of like a parallel here again with the Zoroastrian culture and then the Islamic culture of where in the beginning it's all about memorizing the Quran by the heart. But the point of the story is, guys, when you look at those dates, you'll start to realize that there is no base of arguing, right? There is no base of arguing because you don't have any contemporary evidence and the timeline just destroys everything. And like we said before, you have all these idiosyncrasies that are going on and such. Now, guys, let's get into the topic. So hopefully what we have said now gives you guys some sort of base and understanding, and you guys can absorb the timeline to make it make sense and realize that the whole Islamic narrative is scattered everywhere and everything is all about this line of memorization. And the issue with that is that people forget things, people lie, people twist and bend, because at the end of the day, Just like kings and queens throughout history have made people do things at their will and change things at their will, so do the caliphates, right? The caliphates want to make sure that things make sense to them, or things fit their agenda. Similar like how the Arabs fell in love with Greek philosophy and Greek culture, and they basically adopted it. And we had the House of Wisdom under the Abbasid Caliphate, and that kind of like changed things on how people would interpret or whatever. That's not the point. We're straying from it. But anyways, the point of the story is, now let's focus on the topic of today. So as you guys got that preliminary information, let's talk about today how chapter 18 was copied. So now guys, right? So Alexander the Great is probably so famous that even Prophet Muhammad wanted to be him, right? Because Alexander the Great did the impossible, guys. If you pay attention to this map here, he basically destroyed the Persian army, right? Alexander's army was a dot. The Prince of Macedonia was a dot on the map compared to the Persian army. And what he was going to do was insane, guys. He was such a towering figure that he basically conquered the world, right? And people who are Christians and people of other faiths, like Muslims or whatever, they can't believe. Well, let's not talk about Muslims. Let's just focus on the Christians at the time. The Christians could not understand how a polytheist was able to conquer the world like this. That a polytheist, potential bisexual person conquered the world. God allowed him to do this. And what had happened was there was these stories, guys, that started to develop about Alexander the Great, and they kind of tried to turn him into this type of Christian hero, but he was never a Christian in the first place. But let's go back to Alexander the Great. So, guys, Alexander the Great, after doing the impossible and conquering a little bit of the Persians' army's territory along the Mediterranean Sea, he went to Egypt. Now, this is very important for you guys to understand. Very important for you guys to understand. Now, when Alexander the Great goes to Egypt, he is now going to become a pharaoh. But to become a pharaoh, you have to be in a succession. You have to be part of some sort of a lineage or heritage of pharaohs by blood or something like of that level, or being part of quote unquote a god or something like that. Then you are a pharaoh. So now Alexander the Great gets to Egypt. He basically promises them that he's going to destroy the Persians and he's going to conquer it. So Alexander the Great, after going into the desert and going to this famous shrine, he basically survives the impossible journey in the desert. And when coming back, he had claimed that he is the son of Amun-Ra. Now, this is very important. Amun-Ra was a god, right? Now, Amun-Ra is a god with two horns. Now, why is this important? Because now Alexander the Great is a pharaoh in Egypt, right? You have this Macedonian Greek king, and then now he has become a pharaoh of Egypt, and now he has claimed that he's basically a god. He's basically the son of a god. And now Amun-Ra, his primary trait is he has two horns, right? Like a ram or a goat. Now the point of the story is that Alexander the Great, after claiming that he is now the son of Amun-Ra and becoming pharaoh, after conquering the rest of Persia and basically becoming the king of the world, what happens is that they print coins with Alexander the Great's face on it, and they put horns. So the primary trait of Alexander the Great when going around the world would be these horns. So they would consider him the man with two horns. So in not Arabic, but in the Middle East, the Arabs in Arabic would call Alexander the Great Dhul Qarnayn, which means the possessor of two horns. Now the thing here, guys, you must understand is that, like we said before, that Alexander the Great was known in history as the one with two horns, and this was his primary trait, which is what Dhul Qarnayn is actually referencing. It's someone that holds these traits, that becomes part of their identity. No one else in history is called the one with two horns as an identity, right? This is something that's part of him. Now, if you pay attention here, guys, historical document we're going to be talking about is a book called The History of Alexander the Great by Pseudo-Callisthenes, right? Now, this is the book here, guys. Now, before we get into this book, you need to understand something. Prophet Muhammad, they wanted to know, the people of the Quraysh tribe wanted to know if Prophet Muhammad was lying, right? So what had happened was, they went to the Jewish rabbis and they asked them, what is something that we can ask you, the people of the Torah, that you guys would know that he wouldn't know, to make sure that we know he's a prophet? So they said to ask Prophet Muhammad 3 things. And if he answers these 3 things, he's a true prophet. If he doesn't, he's a liar. So the Qurayshi tribe basically said, go out there, ask the Jewish rabbis, the people of the Torah, and tell them that they know things that Muhammad wouldn't know. So they said to make sure that he's a prophet or not, ask him 3 things, and if he answers all 3 of them, he's a prophet. So one of the 3 things they asked him was to name the mighty traveler who conquered the east and the west, right? Now, the interesting here is that when they ask him this, they're basically asking, who is Dhul Qarnayn? Who is the man, the possessor of the 2 horns, right? Now, the document, which is Muhammad's biography, which is called the Sirah by Ibn Hisham in the year 830. This biography is the source that we're going to use about this. Now, what is very interesting here is that if you pay attention to this, guys, what happened was that Muhammad got really sad, right? Because when they came and asked him, he said that Jibril never came with answers for more than 2 weeks. So for 15 days, the well ran dry, and Prophet Muhammad did not receive any answers from Allah, from Jibril, about who Dhul Qarnayn was and about these other 2 people. So guys, obviously, like we said before, this story comes 200 years after the death, which is tampered by Persians, and it is tampered, and it's just a fairy tale, guys, but we're just using it as a reference. But think about this. They're claiming in this story that for 15 days nothing came about, but we know that there was more than enough time, guys. This could have been 30 days, 40 days, we don't even know. They just told us a number, but nonetheless, we'll go with the 15 days. That is more than enough time for Prophet Muhammad to get all kind of resources to be able to answer these questions. Understand something, guys. Prophet Muhammad wasn't a poor man. He had a network. Any person who's rich and has money, has power, has an army, these people have what? They have the ability to capture and get whatever they want to. They can pay for information. Guys, people can get anything they want to, scrolls, information, especially someone like Muhammad who had so much money, right? So the point of the story is that 15 days later, he supposedly gets revelation, and he now tells everyone who Dhul Qarnayn is. And if you pay attention to the biography of Muhammad here, it clearly says here that they basically told him that Alexander the Great is person who basically traveled the whole earth, conquered the east and west. He was given power over every land, and he reached the farthest confines of creation, right? And now this is the very important part. It is very important about an Islamic source even verifying the fact that Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. It says here, a man who used to purvey stories of the foreigners, which were handed down among them, told me that Dhul Qarnayn was an Egyptian, whose name was Marzuban, the Greek, descended from Yunnan. So they basically just confirmed here that that foreigners used to come to the Middle East and talk about the stories which were handed down to them. Basically ancestral stories, fables, literally oral stories. And they said that Dhul Qarnayn was an Egyptian. What did we just say? We explained that Alexander the Great became the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he claimed to be the son of Amun-Ra, right? And remember, Amun-Ra's primary traits is the possessor of 2 horns, and whose name was Marzuban, and he was a Greek. So who do we know that is of Greek origin, and who was basically an Egyptian at the same time? That was Alexander the Great. And as we said before, you can clearly get spicy, guys. This is where it gets spicy. Now, remember I told you that we're going to go to this book right here, Pseudo-Callisthenes. Now, this is a Christian Syriac poem. It is a story, guys, about Alexander the Great. Because as I told you before, the Christians could not understand how a polytheist, bisexual man would be able to conquer the world. How would God allow that? This is contradicting the teachings of the biblical stories. So this story is kind of like not entirely true. The story that they created is their own heroic version of Alexander the Great. He's the most celebrated hero in history, the most talked about hero, and many people want to be like him, just like Prophet Muhammad wanted to be. So when we pay attention in this book, the Pseudo-Callisthenes, the first thing you must know is that the Pseudo-Callisthenes story, the Syriac version of Alexander the Great, came around the year 600 to 632, right? So it could have been at the beginning of the year 600, the beginning of the 7th century, or the middle of the 7th century. So whenever this story came about, they're not 100% sure. It could have been at the time of Muhammad's death, or it could have been about the time before Muhammad's death. So this is where a lot of Muslims get confused, and they try to refute and go into apologetics by saying the end date of this potential Syrian Christian story comes out about when the Prophet dies, and the Prophet got revelations 20 years before that about this Dhul-Qarnayn character. So that makes no sense. But like I told you before, that historically on the timeline, the source that they're using to contest this is actually a 200 to 300 year old document. So it's invalid. It doesn't work. You cannot fight primary source, a contemporary source that we're using, from a 2 century later document. It doesn't work like that. It's too weak of an argument. It doesn't make any common sense. But nonetheless, guys, let's go into it, right? So if you see here, guys, let's talk about chapter 18, starting from verse 83. You'll notice here it says, they ask you, O prophet, about Dhul-Qarnayn, which is Dhul-Qarnayn. Say, we will relate to you something about his narrative. Right? Now, you can see here above the image that we've put, this is actually a paragraph from the Syriac Christian story, and we highlighted the colors in reference to the words that you see. So you see the green here, guys. O God, Lord of kings and judges, thou who settest upon kings and destroyest their power, I know in my mind that thou hast exalted me above all kings, and thou hast made me horns upon my head. Right? So Alexander the Great basically is saying that God gave him the horns upon his head, aka they asked you, O prophet, about Dhul-Qarnayn, right? Dhul-Qarnayn, the possessor of 2 horns. Okay. Now in blue you can see it says in verse 84 of the Quran, it says here that surely we established him in the land and gave him the means of all things. And you can see here in blue from the Syrian Christian story, it says, give me power from the holy heavens that I may receive strength greater than that of the kingdoms of the world, and that I may humble them, and I will magnify thy name, O Lord, forever, and thy memorial shall be XYZ. The point of the story is, Allah is saying that he established Dhul-Qarnayn in the land and gave him everything, and you can see that basically the Quran has a very vague, watered down, low IQ version, because the Quran is a silly, dumb book. And basically you can see that there's this rich literature coming from the Syriac Christian story, but in the Quran you see these dry ass, dumb verses. But you can see basically it's summarized. Now, let's go. It gets juicier, guys. Now pay attention to this. Verse 85. In yellow we see it says, so he traveled a course. Now if we see in the Christian Syriac story, it says, and they put ships to sea and sailed on the sea for 4 months and 12 days. And they arrived at the dry land beyond the 11 bright seas, right? So he traveled a course, and as you can see in the Syriac Christian story, they went on a ship and they sailed the seas, right? They traveled a course. Okay. Now in the green, it says in the Quran, until he reached the setting point of the sun, which appeared to him to be the setting in a spring of murky water, where he found some people. We said, O Dhul-Qarnayn, either punish them or treat them kindly. Now, so basically, in the Quran, once they were traveling this course, they came to the setting point where the sun was resting in murky water, right? Now, if you pay attention, in the Syriac story above, it says, Alexander and his troops basically encamped, and he sent and called them to the governor who was in the camp and said to them, are there any men here guilty of death? They said to him, we have 30 and 70 men, XYZ. So basically after Alexander and his crew travels a course on the ships, They get to this point, right? They get to the setting point. Now, the place that they get, the people that are there, Alexander the Great asks, yo, is there anyone here that's guilty of death? And they say, how much people? That's why it says in the Quran, we said, oh, Zulkarnain, either punish them or treat them kindly, right? Because that's in reference to what's happening in the story. If there's any men guilty here of death or not. That's why it says, should we punish them or treat them kindly? That's why he said, are there any men here guilty of death, right? If not, whatever. Now, the next part you'll notice, in verse 89, is that right here in the highlighted yellow in the Quran, right? Well, it says here that he traveled a different course, but in the Quran in verse 90, it says, when he traveled this different course, he reached a rising point of the sun. He found it rising on people for whom he had provided no shelter from. So this place that he comes to, the point is basically there's a sun that's shining on the people and they had no shelter from it. If you pay attention to the Syriac Christian story, it says here that once they travel to this new place, right, the place of his rising is over the sea, and the people who dwell there, when he is about to rise, flee away and hide themselves in the sea, that they not be burnt by his rays. And he passes through the midst of the heavens to the place where he enters the window of heaven. So basically, guys, this second place that they come to, there's this burning sensation of the sun, and people have to run away from its rays because it's so hot. Just like the Quran says that on the second point of the place that they reach, they find these people who are trying to basically seek shelter from the sun, right? Now, if you pay attention, in verse 93, it says here that until he reached a pass between two mountains. And you'll notice it says here in the Syriac Christian story, it says, Alexander says, who are the nations within this mountain upon we are looking? Right? Like it says, until he reached a pass between two mountains within this mountain upon which we are looking. If you pay attention to verse 94, it says, they pleaded, O Zulkarnain, surely Gog and Magog are spreading corruption. If you pay attention, guys, it says, they are the Huns. He said to them, who are their kings? The old men said, Gog and Magog, and Nawal, the kings of the sons of Japhet. So basically, you can see now how it's getting more and more juicy, where even though the Quran is vague, you're seeing where they're getting Gog and Magog from, because a person who is Muslim and reading this, and if they actually ask themselves, who the F is Gog and Magog? Like, who are these people? What does this have to do with guidance on humanity? What does this have to do with delivering people from sin? What does this have to do with trying to have a connection with God? Who the hell is Gog and Magog? And who the hell is Zulkarnain? But you guys are seeing how this was copied little by little in a very dry, vague way. Now, guys, pay attention to this. Verse 95 in blue, right? As you can see. But assist me with resources, and I will build a barrier between you and them. If you see in the Syriac Christian story, let us make a gate of brass and close up this breach, right? That's the resources the Quran is talking about, to build a barrier, aka to close up this breach. If you pay attention into red, bring me blocks of iron. Then when he had filled up the gap between the two mountains, he ordered, bow. When the iron became red hot, he said, bring the molten copper to pour over it. I said bow, I meant to say blow. And you see in the red, guys. And Alexander commanded and fetched 3,000 smiths, workers in iron, and 3,000 men, workers in brass. And they put down brass and iron and kneaded it as a man kneads when he works clay. Then they brought it and made a gate, the length of which had 12 cubits and its breadth 8 cubits. Right? So now you can see about this quote-unquote gate, iron, brass, all these type of things. You're understanding where it came from and why it's in here in chapter 18, verse 96 of the Quran. You can see how these elements here are being copied from the Syriac Alexander story. Now, guys, let's get to verse 99. As you can see here, the Quran says, verse 99 and verse 100, on that day we will let them surge like waves over one another. Later, the trumpet will be blown, and we will gather all people together. On that day, we will display hell clearly for the disbelievers. And if you can see in the Christian Syriac story, it says, "And again I have written and made known and prophesied that it shall come to pass at the conclusion of 940 years, another king, when the world shall come to an end, by the command of God, the ruler of creation. Created things shall anger God, and sin shall increase, and wrath shall reign." So basically, like the Quran says, that when the trumpet will be blown, we will gather all people together, and then hell will display all over the non-believers. Like it says in the story, 940 years later, another king will come, and the world shall come to an end. So you see this eschatological type of theme, like how Zoroastrianism was copied, eschatological themes from Zoroastrianism was copied into the Quran. You can see this eschatological theme of doomsday being copied from this Syriac Christian Alexander poem here. And the thing is that you can see this Judgment Day theme being copied here, and Imam Mahdi, this quote-unquote ruler that's going to come save the Muslims. You can see that there's this theme here in this parallel where in the Alexander story, they talk about after 940 years, another king will come when the world will be ending, and or God will be angry, and all the sin will increase, and he'll kind of like be this ruler under God, kind of like this Imam Mahdi figure that you can see them talk about. But the point of the story is, guys, as you can clearly see here from this short piece here, that chapter 18 from verses 80 all the way up to 100, it was a Christian Syriac story copied word for word in a very vague way, but you see the parallel and you understand the timeline, historical references we showed you before. And that is why it's important for you guys to see that this document is where the Muslims would copy it into the Quran to make it make sense, right? Because they wanted to show that they knew of something that would only quote-unquote a prophet would know, because quote-unquote Muhammad was illiterate, so how could he know these type of things? It was all invented and created with such genius, so they have this alibi of why things should happen the way they do. Remember, if we go back to the biography, Ibn Harith, right, this guy, he's basically, they say that he was one of the hated enemies of Muhammad, because why? Ibn Harith had said that that Muhammad learned the tales of the Persians, and when Prophet Muhammad left the seating of the people and was telling them stories, Ibn Harith, Al-Harith came up and said, I can tell better stories than he. Come to me. Then he began to tell them about the kings of Persia, Rustum, and Isbandiyar, and then he would say, in what respect is Muhammad a better storyteller than I? Guys, there's so much juice here that you guys can see that Prophet Muhammad was being basically accused so many times of being copied, the Quran defending itself as an Arabic book, as if it's this unique version of things that where it couldn't have been copied, and it's the commandments of God. And you can clearly see this historical document that there's word for word parallel of the Alexander story. And now the issue is, guys, that when we get into it, a lot of people, after seeing this evidence, people still have lost their mind, and they'll go on and say that the person that is most likely Dhul Qarnayn is none other than Cyrus the Great. Now the issue with that, guys, is that Cyrus the Great, even though he was a great person, Cyrus the Great was never known in history as Dhul Qarnayn, meaning a person that was possessor of two horns. That was never a portion of his identity. That was never something that he was known as. He was just known as Cyrus the Great. As you got to remember something, as we stated before in the Islamic document of his biography, it was known to the Arabs that Dhul Qarnayn was not only an Egyptian, but he was a Greek. He was of Greek descent. And what do we know about Cyrus the Great? Cyrus the Great was a Persian, guys. He was a Persian. And when they see this image here of Cyrus the Great, this is called the Hem crown, guys. Now the Hem crown, it is not something that's an identity. So people get to confuse the fact that Cyrus the Great could be Alexander the Great, because when they see this, the Hem crown, it is a ceremonial crown. Sorry, guys. It is a ceremonial crown. Right, it's a crown for a ceremony. It's not something that's part of his identity, because remember, Alexander the Great said that he was the son of Amun-Ra, and Amun-Ra is a god with horns, right? So this is where they'll try to use it and try to say, hey, no, he has to be Cyrus the Great. And as we said about it before, thing, guys, is that Cyrus the Great was a Zoroastrian. That was his primary religion, because he was a Persian. So the interesting thing is here is that for some reason people don't understand is that Cyrus the Great freed the Jews, right? So when Cyrus the Great basically conquered everything, he basically allowed the Jews to be able to rebuild their temples. He allowed the Jews to practice their religion. He was very kind and great to them. And that is kind of like how Cyrus the Great got into the Bible, right? He became part of the Bible. And as we showed here before, but you can see the parallels. And we hope you guys enjoyed it. Share it, learn it, do research, go deeper into it, and you guys will see. Anyone who's a Muslim, we pray that you leave Islam and come to Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and realizing that the Quran was not only made up and copied, and its preservation, it's a lie, and it had been corrupted, and many people had their hands in it. But more importantly, you can see today the historical proof that the Quran, chapter 18, was copied from a Syriac Christian story.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.